Syria has sentenced Bashar al-Assad to death, even though the man who ruled the country for nearly 25 years is sitting safely in Russia. The verdict marks the first death sentence against Assad or his inner circle since his family's 5-decade grip on Syria collapsed. But the real question is not whether Damascus can execute Assad. It is whether this verdict can force Moscow to choose between protecting its former ally and building a relationship with Syria's new rulers. A Syrian court in Damascus sentenced Assad and his younger brother Maher to death in absentia for crimes against humanity and war crimes committed during Syria's 14-year conflict. Assad's maternal cousin Atef Najib received the same sentence, but unlike the Assad brothers, Najib appeared in court wearing a prisoner's uniform. The case reaches back to the Syrian uprising in 2011. Najib commanded the political security branch in Dara, where security forces arrested and tortured teenagers who had written anti-government graffiti on a school wall. The crackdown helped turn local anger into nationwide protests. Syria descended into a civil war that killed about 500,000 people. Assad's government collapsed in December 2024 after a lightning rebel offensive. Assad and Maher fled to Russia, where they received political asylum. Syria's new authorities have since demanded that Moscow hand them over. That sets up the first revelation. This sentence is less about punishment than establishing legal ownership of Syria's past. Assad's government controlled the courts and security agencies that could have investigated its own abuses. That system disappeared with his government. The new authorities want to create a record that identifies the former president as responsible for crimes committed through the state. Judge Fakhreddine Al-Aryan said Assad used state agencies to commit war crimes and crimes against humanity. It places the Syrian state's machinery at the center of the prosecution. Najib's case makes that connection especially powerful. His actions in Dara became one of the earliest symbols of the crackdown. The arrests and torture became a catalyst for protests that spread across the country. The new government can turn accountability into a national narrative. The revolution dismantled a system that allegedly used state power against its own population. But a court can issue a sentence. It cannot bring back a defendant protected by another country. And that is where Russia becomes central. The second revelation is that Assad's sentence puts Moscow in an awkward position. Russia supported Assad throughout much of the civil war and intervened militarily in 2015 to prevent his government from collapsing. Russian air power and political backing helped Assad survive. Then, when his government fell, Moscow gave Assad and his brother asylum. Now Damascus wants them back. If Russia refuses, the verdict could become a symbol of Moscow's protection of a former Syrian ruler accused of war crimes. If Russia extradites Assad, Moscow would abandon a man it protected after years of military partnership. Russia has strategic interests in Syria beyond Assad. Moscow has built influence along the Mediterranean and maintained military infrastructure there. After Assad's fall, Russia has tried to preserve relations with Syria's new leadership rather than openly confront it. The Assad case tests that strategy. Moscow may want access to Syrian ports, military facilities, and political channels. Damascus, meanwhile, wants recognition, sovereignty, and justice for the former regime's crimes. So Assad has become more than a former president. He has become a bargaining chip in the relationship between Moscow and the new Syria. The third revelation: the verdict could reshape Syria's transition, but it could also create instability. The new leadership needs to show victims and families that the old system will not disappear without consequences. After 14 years of war and roughly 500,000 deaths, a symbolic trial may not satisfy a population that wants accountability. Assad's conviction also raises questions about thousands of people associated with the former regime. The prosecution of Najib provides a visible example because he was detained inside Syria and could stand before the court. Assad and Maher cannot. If the new government can prosecute senior figures who remain in Syria while continuing to demand extraditions from Russia, it can demonstrate that accountability does not depend entirely on capturing every former official. But if the process appears selective or politically motivated, opponents could call it a political score-settling exercise. Syria remains fragile with armed factions, regional rivalries, and foreign influence. A high-profile death sentence could strengthen domestic support for the new authorities, yet it could also harden divisions between communities that experience the war differently. The regional implications are significant. For countries that supported Assad, the verdict signals a new phase. For former opposition communities, it offers a symbol of accountability. For Russia, it shows that its former ally no longer controls Syria's narrative. For Europe and the United States, the case also raises a broader question. How should the international community respond when a new government seeks justice against a former ruler who lives abroad under foreign protection? For ordinary Syrians, however, the most important issue remains personal. Millions lost relatives, homes, and livelihoods during the war. Many families still do not know what happened to people who disappeared into prisons and detention centers. A death sentence against Assad cannot undo those losses. It can, however, establish a principle. Holding the highest-ranking figures responsible matters even when they no longer control the state. But the verdict also creates a test for Syria's new institutions. If Damascus can pursue senior figures through courts while protecting due process, it could strengthen confidence in a state that has spent decades operating through security agencies and emergency powers. If prosecutions become instruments of revenge, the same process could deepen sectarian and political divisions. That distinction will determine whether Assad's trial becomes the foundation of a new legal order or simply another chapter in Syria's long cycle of political retribution. The sentence may never be carried out. Assad remains in Russia, and the Syrian government has no immediate power to seize him there. But the verdict changes his status inside Syria forever. The man who once controlled the state now faces a death sentence from that state's successor government. Syria's war may have ended on the battlefield, but the struggle over who answers for its past has only just begun.